This is the Kratom Science Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Gallagher, blog and social media writer for kratom-science.com, your source for all things kratom. My guest is journalist Nick Wing, editor of theappeal.org. In his former job at Huffington Post, he revealed that the FDA's supposed kratom-caused deaths included, among other questionable findings, a man who was shot in the chest. His relentless questioning of the FDA's narrative proved to be the best journalistic work thus far on the topic of kratom. First, I was just going to ask you about The Appeal. You're an editor there.
Yep. The Appeal is a nonprofit news outlet that really focuses on the criminal legal system and some other systems across society in the U.S. that have really failed in doing what they claim to do. You know, I think the people think of the criminal legal system as something that provides justice and safety for people, but when you look at the way it actually plays out across the U.S., it's incapable of doing that in so many ways, and it really creates a lot of harm and perpetuates a lot of the problems that I think the average American thinks that it is designed to address. So there are just so many ways in which we see laws enforced in sort of unfair, often racist, or just completely unjust ways that target people based on their skin color or their circumstances or the amount of money they have. And we see this a lot in drug policy too. You know, drug policy is seen as drugs themselves, and drug use is seen as like a moral failing. And the way we address those issues is to arrest people and to, punish them pretty harshly for using substances. And it's just, a complete fallacy. That's not, it's not the way to deal with the problem, even if you admit that it's a problem. And some people, I think, understandably think that drug use should be an issue of autonomy, and it's really not the purpose of the government to get involved in that at all. But, certainly punishing people very harsh for those who do have legitimate problem, and for issues where drugs are, cause public safety problems, punishing people incredibly harshly, throwing them in jail and really destroying their lives doesn't solve the underlying issue. It just creates more trauma and makes people more likely to go on to, commit future crimes and to be driven to drug use and stuff like that. So yeah, pretty much The Appeal covers those systems as they exist, and advocates in some ways for solutions that really get to the core problems of a lot of the things we see in society.
Yeah, and that sounds like something that our listeners would be interested in reading. It's good that we have journalism that actually does the job of journalism rather than the sensationalist clickbait, which I want to talk about with you a little bit more later. And you actually did a story for HuffPost talking about people in states where kratom was banned and, what their lives were like. A couple people got arrested. One lady got arrested and she said, "I'm lucky I have the money, or my kids would have been taken away from me." There's another guy got arrested and he got thrown in the drug tank with a guy who was going through a mental health episode because he'd been up for days on meth and he got beaten. If kratom was illegal, that would be the reality everywhere. Be just treated just like another drug. And so you wrote that for Huffington Post. So you went to college for journalism, and you started pretty soon after you started at the Huffington Post. How long were you there for? It was about like 9 or 10 years?
Yeah, pretty much almost 10 years. Definitely more than 9, but I was I think about to be coming up on 10. Yeah.
And so what happened with the Huffington Post? They got bought out by Verizon, is that right?
Well, what happened to Huffington Post is kind of what's happening to a lot of media right now. These companies are being sort of passed around by bigger companies, or being consolidated, and then company comes in and decides that it can't really justify the spending on staff because advertising revenues are falling off. So the entire model is sort of coming under scrutiny right now, and it's leading to a lot of contraction in the market. And so when I had been there, I mean, multiple times there had been pretty massive layoffs where we lost large chunks of staff. And so I was caught up in a round of layoffs, and there have since been a couple since I left. I mean, the remaining staff is pretty small, and the issues we cover are, smaller and smaller set of issues. So it's not, not just HuffPost, it's happening all over the country. I think what's pretty relevant actually to the kratom debate is that, local media is really contracting in a similar way. A lot of newspapers are folding or selling to bigger conglomerates. And when it comes to drug reporting, I mean, it really needs to be looked at the local level. There are the landscape around these policies, the landscape around the consumers, the landscape around the actual vendors. I mean, that's all tends to be a local issue. It looks different in different places. And when you don't have reporting resources to really dig into the different, aspects of the way that might look in a community, people are left to do the low-hanging fruit of news stories. And around drugs, the low-hanging fruit are the drug scare stories. I mean, they're the ones that are headline, new drug, kills this person who was a promising young man. And then you have the distraught mother who is dealing with a legitimate tragedy, who's trying to make sense of it. And the best way they can make sense of it is to blame it all on a substance that they felt was consuming their son or their daughter's life. And, reporters who don't have the time to go do the actual reporting to look into whether that's true or not, take that story at face value and they write the sort of clickbait story. They write the sensational drug scare story and they run with it. And I do think that in a world in which you had more resources and you had better, more skilled, more seasoned reporters at the local level, there would be more appetite to look into that sort of thing. And it wouldn't just be regurgitating the narrative that they're getting from law enforcement or that they're getting from local anti-drug groups or that they're getting from, the sober living community or things like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, and just everybody in the kratom community that looks at this media gets really frustrated because there's some of the FDA stuff's being repeated. I mean, that's one thing. I mean, I can understand how somebody would look at the FDA and say, well, this is what they say, that's all I have time to look into it. And I call it drug horror fiction because it just goes back. I mean, I grew up in the 80s with Just Say No and everything, and it goes all the way back to that. I mean, other than you and Peter Hess did some articles for Inverse, there's not a whole lot of deep diving in mainstream outlets for the kratom story. And is it just because most, the journalists don't have the resources to go into it and do all the work that leads up to a good story?
I think, for a lot of people who report on drugs, they don't necessarily come at it from the place that I did, which was to be really curious about how the sausage of drug policy gets made. So that's a big issue. I think they sort of follow the news as worthy news in itself that this is happening, but they don't think about the motives for why things are happening, or they don't think about the reflexive tendencies in our society, the sort of anti-drug tendencies that drive a lot of the policy debate. So I think a lot of reporters in this space are sort of more passive observers to that process, and they don't actually think about what's happening. Some do, and I guess part of the problem is that there's so many conversations around different drugs happening in this country that kratom fills a pretty small gap there when you talk about all of the developments that are happening around cannabis and other psychedelics right now, different drug therapies that are being approved. There's decriminalization of psilocybin and mushrooms, and all that stuff is really fascinating. And I guess for the few people who are really covering all of that, kratom is just a very small niche, and they might feel either like they don't really have the time to take it on, or that, there's even the possibility that they just feel that not enough people would read the story that they're writing. So they feel that the time would be better invested elsewhere.
Yeah, yeah. And do you remember when you first started to report about kratom? Was it in 2016?
I think so. Yeah, 2016. If I remember, I did the first story. There was right around the time a couple state bills were starting to move, and I think there had been. This may have been actually before the DEA had even caught in, but I saw a set of local news stories at sort of TV news and a couple newspapers around the country reporting on deaths, and then I saw that those deaths, reported death, I should clarify, were driving local legislation in an effort to really ban it at the state level. So that's when I caught on. And, anytime a drug is being discussed for potential prohibition, I really think it's important to look at the facts so much as there are actual facts that are going into that debate, because we know from history that it's just a minefield of misinformation.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you more about that too. But there was one report you did that was pretty funny. You did a video with it. It was, the headline was, "I tried a soon-to-be banned herb in front of the White House." So when you did that story, had you ever tried kratom before?
No, that was the first time, and I remember thinking shortly after that I probably took more than the introductory dose. I think I took the same dose that the kind woman who offered me what she would normally take, but she had serious chronic pain issues, and I sort of just downed it, and then it was more intense than I thought it would be. It was not by any means scary, but I was like, oh, this stuff actually works.
Yeah. And I think that's the one thing I was thinking about. A lot of the poison control center calls are just people that are scared, because when you look at that data, it's mostly, they have nausea or they feel a little irritated or something, or irritable, and I think it was like people that were surprised that it worked.
Yeah, I mean, kratom does sort of fall, if you think of a supplement, right? I mean, like you go to head shops and there's all these different supplements, or you go to a supplement store, and a lot of them, I think people are right to be skeptical about whether or not they work. You won't see immediate effects, or it requires weeks of use or something like that. And kratom is most definitely not that. For anything that people say about it, it definitely has an effect, and it has a pretty immediate and tangible effect. So worth acknowledging the reality.
But nobody was that at the it was a rally outside the White House you're at, but nobody died from kratom that day, I assume.
Not that I'm aware of. Certainly that would have
Okay.
That would have been a much bigger news story, I'm sure.
But if somebody would have gotten hit by like the presidential limo or something and died, it would have been a kratom-related death. You looked at a lot of these so-called kratom-related deaths, and the one that you discovered from the FDA's reporting, they redacted a lot of the information, but it turned out there was a guy that died of a gunshot wound, and the FDA included that in their kratom-related deaths. We just looked at that Jane Babin report, and she actually referenced your work in her report on FDA fails to follow the science on kratom. Can you talk about how you discovered that, and just talk about that case report a little bit?
Yeah, that entire batch of cases was based on voluntary reports, I think, to the FDA, sort of adverse event reports from people across the country. There was a set that was from loved ones of individuals who had died. There was a set from, I think, medical examiners. But all of that information tends to be, or those reports tend to be disaggregated and heavily redacted. So you can't learn any identifying information about who the individuals are. As a result, the entire set was really unhelpful. I mean, it sort of gave you an idea of maybe the race and age of the average kratom user. But apart from that, you really didn't get a whole ton of info. And that case in particular had been heavily redacted. I think, there were multiple pages, but really only a couple words about the individual's gender and their race and maybe their overall health. But in going through that database, there was a case number that was actually consistent across multiple FDA databases. And through the help of some sleuthing from some sources on Twitter, I think this actually came from Chris Redding, he noticed that that case number, if you looked at another FDA database, was not redacted. And in that other database, it showed up as a gunshot wound where someone had been admitted to a hospital and was deceased. And the toxicology tests showed that mitragynine or kratom was among a number of drugs, I think, that were in that person's system. So it got lumped in as an associated death. And that's particularly absurd, but there were a lot of other cases that were just absurd. I mean, it seemed very clear that kratom had completely unknown, if any, weight on the person's death. And people who fell out of windows, people who appeared to have overdosed on multiple opioids, things like that. And it's like, at that point, the presence of kratom doesn't really tell you a whole lot. One thing I was thinking about recently, actually, that is a sort of parallel here, there was some reporting around deaths that I think anti-vax people tried to associate with the COVID vaccine. And they said, 100 people have died after getting the COVID vaccine. And, and that was they were trying to play those off as associated deaths. But when you think about it, if, tens of thousands of people are getting a COVID vaccine every day, people die, and people die for lots of reasons. And if you just look at these two isolated similarities that are between them, they lose all meaning. I mean, if someone got hit by a car after getting the COVID vaccine, yeah, they died after getting the COVID vaccine. Did the COVID vaccine have anything to do with that death? No. So you see it play out. People use the same tactics for their own sort of political ends, and you see it playing out still now.
You quoted them, I think it was like on a Twitter thread, I just have it here in my notes, but it said, using a new computational model, the agency feels confident in calling compounds found in kratom opioids. Did you get the idea that they were just kind of like doing a database search of mitragynine and deaths and just lumping that all in with kratom associated deaths? Is that all they were doing, or was there any indication they were doing like further investigation on individual cases?
I think there was some language that suggested they were reaching out to confirm or to isolate various things. So I think that you're right, though. I think they cast the broadest possible net they could. They wanted to define any death in which mitragynine was present as a kratom-associated death. I suppose it's possible that there were some even more obviously not related cases in that set and that they excluded those. But based on what I've seen from future reports in which they expanded that number, it just seems like that's their definition, and they're looking for as many cases as they can to fill out that number.
Yeah, and there was the case, too, that it was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. It looked at 15 supposedly kratom-alone deaths in Colorado. Researchers found 14 cases, multiple substances were involved, and the remaining, they couldn't do the blood samples. And that kind of gets me to like the medical examiner and coroner question. There was a report that you posted at one point from Henningfield, Babin, and Grunman, who I interviewed for here. But they said medical examiners and coroners are incorrectly reporting kratom-involved deaths as kratom-caused deaths. Can you speak a little bit about that, and have you seen these kinds of mistakes with, other drug deaths and like weighing too much on the coroner's report? And Carl Hart's new book, the appendix shows what kind of qualifications you need per state. And for the example of Colorado, you just need to take some kind of like 12-hour course or something, and you can be elected coroner, which doesn't necessarily give you like a forensic toxicology degree. Can you speak a little bit about that, about the issue with medical examiners and their conclusions about these deaths?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's clear in looking at these cases that, medical examiners are given a limited piece of information to work with, right? If they if they have to do a tox screen, they get a blood sample, they run the screen, and then they report what the screen shows. And with that, they're often, a medical examiner is often asked to come up with an explanation for someone's death. And I think when you look at it, the human body is pretty complicated. There are a number of ways people can die. And if a substance appears in someone's body, it's become an easy explanation for a death. And I'm not saying necessarily that, drugs don't kill a fair number of people, because they do. But I think what we've seen in these cases are that, this is a new drug of concern, quote unquote, to explain how they're viewing it. So once that narrative starts to build that this is a drug that can kill people, I think the presence of mitragynine in someone who has died is, it's a sort of flag to coroners and to medical examiners that this is a potential answer for a death that they couldn't otherwise explain. And that becomes super problematic because there's no, they need to be a little less credulous about that narrative. They need to go do their own research and look into the science about whether and how this is killing people to confirm that it is before they're making that conclusion. But instead, you have a bunch of people sort of following this narrative, and it creates this feedback loop where, kratom equals bad equals deadly, and then that just feeds itself.
Yeah, and it seems in the primary research that mitragynine alone, it's hard for scientists to kill rats with it, to put it that way. I mean, there might be something into like the drug-drug interactions, but mitragynine alone doesn't seem, and yeah, they don't have like the mechanism by which it causes death. Like we know, like a heroin overdose might cause respiratory depression, and that's how people die. But since this kratom doesn't cause respiratory depression, we really don't know how it would kill you. So I don't understand how they can even say this caused the death when there's just no science to back it up.
I remember speaking with a medical examiner, a guy who actually he was a professor down in Florida, and he had taught some classes on this sort of stuff. And I asked him, can this kill people? And he said, absolutely, it can. And I said, well, how is that happening? And he said, well, I can't explain that to you, but I've heard from medical examiners around the country that this is happening. And, so this is a professional who's telling me it's happening, can't explain why it's happening. And his reason for why it's happening is that he's listening to other medical examiners who are telling him it's happening.
Yeah.
If there's not a clear example of this being sort of groupthink around the potential harms of this drug, then I don't really know what else there could be.
Yeah. I mean, and then as far as I can tell, it's kind of like you can get water intoxication. So if somebody like manages to put enough of the extract in their body, I mean, it's kind of like a water intoxication type thing where, sure, it can kill you. And if you drink enough water, it can kill you. There was just one new kratom death report, still leave more questions than answers. I was just going to ask, it said Huffington Post obtained more than a dozen autopsy reports. Do you have to do a freedom of information request for each report that you get?
It sort of varies. If I remember, is this the Florida data set that you're looking at?
Yeah, Florida and Michigan. Yeah, this is from 2018.
I think with Florida, I had seen some local reports that had cited specific counties that had reported these deaths. And instead with those, because they weren't housed at a state agency, I had to FOIA the specific county medical examiner. I think that's the way the system works down there. And they were pretty receptive in Florida. I remember they fought it a little bit more in Michigan. But the states will vary on how permissive their sort of sunshine or freedom of information laws are. But you usually, I think, have to go to the reporting agency, which in many cases will be the county agency, unless the state has decided that it wants to do a statewide report of this, and then the state may have access to all of the county reports. But when I did most of them, it was at the county level.
There's this issue of like the FDA keeps turning down, requests like this about what they're basing their statements on. One point, the FDA has not revealed any further information about the 36 case. This is probably about 2017. It denied HuffPost's request to immediately release the data and has responded to other reporters' requests saying they couldn't locate it. So there's all kinds of like over and over again. It seems like they're trying to hide something or just not give the data. I guess like why do you think they're doing that if they're so? I guess they're not so confident their argument holds water.
Yeah, I've struggled to explain that. I think, I really do think there is a belief at the FDA that kratom is dangerous. I honestly do think that they believe that.
Okay.
Now, they haven't done the necessary scientific work to confirm that hypothesis. What they've done is fabricate data sets that just follow what they've already agreed is their conclusion. And why they would do that, I don't really know. I mean, I think there could be legitimate fears that because the market is in such an unregulated state that it opens the door to potential problems, which is not entirely untrue. I mean, one thing that I talk about in this space all the time is that there is a need for more regulation, more standardization of products, and that, in fact, the gray market and in many ways the black market, it doesn't really help anybody except for maybe some unscrupulous vendors. So
yeah,
it's not that I think they don't care at all about what they view as public health concerns. It's just that they've done a really poor job of being honest and open in their analysis of kratom, and instead they've decided upon a narrative, and everything that they've done has been to reinforce that narrative rather than to actually check if it's true.
I mean, and I'll tell you, like, another thought that I've had about it, and I think even Jane Babin alluded to this in her report, FDA Fails to Follow Science, the one she referenced your work in. Drug companies have been trying to develop a pain medication, especially lately, that doesn't have those side effects. And I know you interviewed Andrew Krugel, who he did one of the studies he did at Columbia. He found that kratom doesn't recruit B-arrestin after it hits the mu-opioid receptor, which the recruitment of B-arrestin is what causes the respiratory and side effects in classical opioids. So once they discovered that that's what causes it, discovered kratom or mitragynine or 7-hydroxy doesn't do that with the side effects, then that's kind of like their golden ticket for a pain reliever that drug companies have been trying to develop. Therefore, I mean, if you get somebody like Scott Gottlieb as head of the FDA, who goes through the revolving doors, now at Pfizer, that maybe they're trying to control kratom, because if it's Schedule 1, research will only be very limited to somebody that can access a DEA license to research it. So there's kind of like, do you think it's that calculated of a political move, or is it really just only a sincere concern that kratom's dangerous?
I think it's impossible to know for sure. I think that you're totally right. This conflict of interest can only raise that question that this is not being done in good faith. At the end of the day, it may not be any motivation, a single motivation entirely, right? It could be both. It could be that, sure, this drug could show promise, and at some point we're going to make billions of dollars off of it, but in its current form, we have concerns about it, so we want to make sure people aren't using it now, but once we do our official FDA approved, testing and trials, that sure, maybe it'll be useful. it just so happens that that's one way you can hold all of the money and profits around this. But I think that the way the FDA works and that people in this sort of drug approval space work is they tend to err on the side of caution, and they tend to be very skeptical of any substance that hasn't gone through rigorous testing, or clinical trials. So you have all of these different forces coming together, and some of them more nefarious and sort of conspiratorial than others. And at the end of the day, it's just like a perfect storm of motivations to keep people from using a substance that's working for them. So I don't really know which one it is, or if it's any of those or all of those combined. But it seems pretty clear that it's a powerful force for people to try to keep this in a gray market or ban it entirely.
And I wanted to ask you about the man who died in a car accident in Chester County, PA. He's a young man. His parents sued a kratom company from California because he had found kratom in his system, and the official cause of death was acute mitragynine intoxication. You were working on that story, and you wanted to see the toxicology reports. You went through PA's Office of Open Records, and I guess just talk about what happened with that.
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that some counties were pretty forthcoming and willing to share all the information they had about certain deaths and certain toxicology screens related to that death. Chester County was the complete opposite. I mean, they fought it every step of the way. They wanted to offer no transparency about how they came to this conclusion, it's sort of this perfect case speaking to why it's important to have that information. I mean, you have a case with a really weird outcome, which is, according to the coroner, someone who overdosed acutely in a car, really just sudden death in a car while they were driving, and then had a pretty big accident, but somehow the accident didn't contribute to it at all, and that it was just the overdose. But because we couldn't see the information, we didn't know how much kratom that this person may have taken, or what product they may have taken, or so we were really in the dark, and we were left instead with a narrative that had been clearly publicized by the family. And the family, understandably, is distraught. I mean, they've lost a young son. This guy, I think, had some mental health and maybe past substance abuse issues.
Yeah.
They were traumatized by this event, and they were looking for someone to blame. And that happens in so many of these cases, and you can kind of see where people come from. The unfortunate reality, though, is it's not usually as simple as we can blame it on this specific substance or this specific product. It's, a confluence of factors that are probably hard to accept if you're dealing with the tragic and unexpected loss of a loved one. So the narrative was controlled entirely by the family and by a friendly reporter in Pennsylvania who was speaking with the family. The family, I don't think, was speaking with other reporters either. And they were sort of left to tell the story. So just, despite all the efforts to try to get some transparency so we could make sure that they were making valid claims, the office just refused to do it. And we were in the process of filing a lawsuit, which I'm pretty sure we were going to win, that might have had bigger implications for freedom of information requests in Pennsylvania. But that's right when I left HuffPost, and, there weren't multiple reporters at HuffPost who cared about kratom, believe it or not. So, so when I left, the lawsuit died, and I'm not sure really what happened to it. I know that there had been some talk of that, the family's lawsuit against the vendor proceeding. I think vendors, because they're selling a product that is not FDA approved, they carry a fair amount of risk. And I could understand how a family who wanted to blame them would see a sort of easy target in terms of both getting financial compensation from the vendor, but also, an easy way to sort of take that vendor down because they feel that the vendor had acted in a way that contributed to the death of their family member. So yeah, I think all of that you see that playing out in a bunch of cases. I think you see family members of people who have died supposedly after taking kratom suing vendors. And it's just a reality that I think in the current state of the industry, that's going to be a risk that vendors run, which is another reason why there should be, some sort of standards and regulations around it, just to give basic protection, not only to consumers, but to vendors.
Yeah, really, because I remember looking at that, and I did a blog post about it. Their lawyer was saying, well, there was no dosage claims on the package. And by the way, the package he was holding up was just plain leaf kratom. It wasn't in an extract. For him to overdose, he probably would have had to take 2 kilos of it. But he was saying, there's no information on the package, and I'm like, well, for one thing, that's illegal. You can't make dosage or medical claims. So my basic question was, why do you think the coroner didn't want to release the toxicology report?
This is something that I think reporters come up against a lot, and I think coroners and medical examiners, they're kind of in a law enforcement capacity. They work with police, they work with law enforcement. Their rulings have bearing on, criminal legal system outcomes. They have a lot of power, and they have a lot of weight to control all sorts of things with their determinations. And I don't think they like the idea of having to be transparent. I think they want to maintain that power, and they don't want to be second guessed. And when a reporter comes knocking saying that maybe they screwed up and that their screw up could have, financial implications for people, but also have led a family member to believe something that is not correct, they get scared, and they don't want to open the books. So I think, just as much as this could have been a specific thing about this specific case, I'm willing to believe also that it was just an overarching principle of a medical examiner in this county in Pennsylvania who didn't want people to be able to snoop around and check her work. And that has, big implications for the trust that people have in medical examiners, but in their mind, the average person won't care and will continue to take their findings at face value. So it's better off that way, right?
I guess Mari Schaefer actually said that she saw the toxicology reports, and this is on Twitter, exchange you had with her on Twitter, and you said, I guess you got that from the family, and then she was like, they were correct. But you said, I can't assume they're correct because there have been discrepancies, because manner and cause of death is public info, but we don't know that the report was right.
Sure, we don't know the report was right. I think some people might be more willing to believe that there's a possibility of that it was correct if they saw the concentration of mitragynine in this young man's blood, and it was, through the roof. They might say, well, something weird happened here. We don't know what exactly, but okay, that much may have caused some sort of health interaction. Yeah. But the way we're left with it, it's, we've seen in other reports, 20 nanograms, the equivalent of half of a cup of tea, being listed as a cause of death. That just, so if that sort of thing showed up on the report, I think there would be a lot more cause for skepticism, but we just don't know.
Yeah. And it sucks because if it literally killed him and, he had some kind of condition, I want to tell everybody on this show, if you have this, and this, don't take kratom because, this kid passed out and he got in a car accident. That's kind of the frustrating thing is I don't want to, just because I do a kratom podcast, I don't want to, tell everybody it's safe all the time, but I wish we could have the information. So, if there's conditions where kratom is unsafe, I can tell people, but there's just no evidence. Like with the toxicology, if it goes to trial, would then that report be become public?
Unclear, I think, but you would imagine that if they're making the claim that, kratom, this product killed someone, that they would have to provide some documentation as to how they came to that claim. I don't know whether that means in court you could just have the coroner stand up and say, I made the determination, accept me as an expert witness, or whether that person would also have to show the official documentation. I would hope that, the company would seek that documentation just so they could look at whatever the coroner was looking at. But I don't know. The system tends to give a lot of weight to so-called experts in this space, and you can kind of understand why. But I think when you're not allowed to check their work or second guess them, it is problematic.
I was just looking at a couple other things. You did another FOIA request to the FDA about toxic levels of metals in kratom, and I think they denied that. There was, I had Walt Progelic on the show. He went around western Chicago suburbs, bought kratom and head shops, and he found that there were some levels of toxic metals in some of the products where if you take 10 grams a day or more, which I would consider like a heavier user, then you'd develop problems over time. So why do you think they denied this request? Because there actually is some evidence to show that there is some toxic metal problems in some products.
I really can't explain that. Honestly, it follows a broader pattern of them not wanting to be fully transparent. I think federal agencies, even regulatory agencies, don't want to make a habit of giving reporters what they want to check their work. And I think, it could have been a concern that they hadn't done their due diligence, and that a reporter who was looking at this with a more critical eye might have poked some holes in what they were looking at. There could have been legitimate privacy concerns where they didn't want to give information about specific vendors without knowing for sure whether the information was correct, or really, I think, hard to say. But to your point, I think the lack of transparency, both around this and around the death reports, it only can hurt the consumer. If you identify with certainty products in a certain region or coming from a certain vendor that are dangerous, then the consumer should know that so that they can be educated about which products to steer clear from. If you know that a lot of people seem to be dying, after taking kratom and another drug, people should know that. We should know the trends. If you see that people are with an underlying health condition are dying after taking X amount of kratom, and it's they're also noticing pulmonary embolisms. I'm just making that up, but if you're spotting trends in the data, which you would presume if you had access to all of the data you could do, then the consumers should know so that they have a clear idea. But it's so obvious that the tendency away from transparency is actually making things more dangerous, which doesn't serve anybody, and it's just really disappointing.
Before you make millions of people criminals, do the due diligence to check to see if your argument is sound. I'm looking at this story you did on the Ohio kratom ban that said the most common way people ingest kratom is through a needle, which is insanely. I don't think anybody's ever done that, and if they did, it probably hurt really bad.
I think in that case, in a bunch of others, I think a really powerful underlying narrative that's pushing this entire momentum for a ban is the belief that people who are using kratom, and drug users in general, but especially people who have had opioid use or abuse issues, is that they're all drug-seeking zombies in a way, and that they're shooting stuff into their veins all the time, and that given, a powerful enough drug, they'll always take it to the point of abuse and that they're going to do all these horrible things. So I think any piece of information that follows that picture of people using drugs is something that the people who are pushing for the ban will use to then, say we need to get this off the streets because we don't want, people who are like that abusing this, and we don't want other people who aren't using it yet falling into those patterns. And it's just a really gross portrayal of people who use drugs, and especially for kratom, which, so many people who are using kratom have had experiences, and in many cases, really bad experiences with other traditional opioids, especially. So to say that people who are using kratom to get away from drugs that actually were problematic, and to call those people all addicted or problematic users is, offensive, obviously, to the people, but it's just a misrepresentation as well. It feeds this hysteria and this unfair depiction of people who use these substances.
So in terms of drugs, substances, a lot of other things, it's really about who controls the narrative more than about the actual science. I think that's why journalism is so important. Like real journalism. I'll end with a different question. Who are some of your favorite journalists, past or present?
Wow,
you might want to name past, because then you'll probably leave out some of your friends.
Yeah. I mean, I would say I recently read the book by Michael Pollan about psychedelic drugs, called How to Change Your Mind. And I think, just as an example of how one should go about covering drug use and substances, I think that's a really good example of someone who acknowledged their biases coming into something and tried to account for them and to really probe them in a meaningful way. And also someone who is willing to, try the substances themselves and to see what sort of validity, like what it was all about. And then also someone who's willing to speak in depth to experts, not just on the scientific side, but on the sort of cultural side, who could really give a nuanced, robust, three-dimensional portrait of all of the issues that surrounds something like, in this case, psychedelic drug use. But I mean, you just don't have a lot of reporters that are really willing to do that. I know that a lot of people have written books about the opioid epidemic, and some of them have been better than others about trying to be careful about being human-centric, to like not demonize individuals who have been using these drugs, who have been addicted to these drugs. But I think there is a tendency to ignore the really like human factors that go into drug use, and to let that be a really bad guiding principle throughout. And if you don't have sympathy at all for the people who are using this or the reasons why they have started using it, you just feel less obligated to look deeply into the science. You feel less obligated to talk to experts because you get a black and white narrative and you've already decided what side you're on, and it's from there everything follows, and that's just not how it should be.
Check out Nick Wing at theappeal.org, Twitter at NickPWing. We have a link to his kratom stories at Huffington Post. We need more real journalism like this, not only for the kratom community, but for the country as a whole. The music is Risey. The song is Memories of Thailand. The Kratom Science Podcast is written and produced by me, Brian Gallagher, for kratomscience.com. Take care.